All right. Hey, class, here we go. Unit 10 lecture. So, what we're going to talk about today is the move to what I'm going to classify as modern environmentalism. And I'm going to say that this is going to be from roughly the 1960s. You could say even a little earlier. We're not going to be overly precise about dates here, but to present day. And I want to talk about some of the transformations that occur throughout the environmental movement. So at this point, it should, I feel like in our course of study, you should start to have a pretty decent understanding of where modern environmentalism is coming from. And I think that you should be starting to have a cognitive separation between what's conservation, what's preservation, and then what's environmentalism. Because as I think you know from watching the movies this week, reading the book, that typically environmentalism connotates a little bit more of an overt political action. Not in all cases. I mean, the term is used by many people in many different ways, but oftentimes environmentalism means it's a political stance as much as a ethical stance about how we think about and how we perceive the environment and the natural world as a voting public or a democratic population. So it becomes a political label, more or less, as I'm sure you're all aware of looking at our own current politics. So at this point, you should see up at the top here, I put romanticism and transcendentalism. We've got that rugged individualism. I could have put independence in here, that kind of fierce independence that's associated with transcendentalism and romanticism. The Enlightenment, getting back, I know I've beaten this up over the course of the semester and illustrated it many times, but the Enlightenment, although it created, the concept of individual rights and, even the Bill of Rights was a direct offshoot from the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment and the industrial age and rationalism, the individual wasn't prioritized as much as the forward progress of society, child labor and all those things we talked about many units ago. But the transcendentalists and the romantics are really going to prize the individual over the government and or structured civilization and society. So that's where and why I'm talking about this is because we're going to talk about a little bit about anarchism during this particular unit. And I think that's really fueled by rugged individualism, and we see it coming from both romantic tradition and the transcendental tradition. It has other roots, but it definitely, these things will fuel these notions of anarchy. So we also know if we go back and we think about Leopold, we've got ethics in here, we've got the study of ecology, we have a general distrust of government that's going to be fueled here and fueling again back into here. We have that constant ongoing reaction against industrialism and the environmental consequences of industrialism. All of these things are going to be obviously fueling over into this notion of modern environmentalism. There's going to be an element of civil disobedience, and this is going to be questioned. What is civil disobedience? And this is a question I want you all to ask yourself, as you contemplate these ideas, is what does it mean to be, this Thoreauvian transcendental notion of civil disobedience? What does this include? Does this include sit-ins and protests? Does this include, as Ed Abbey and refers to as night work, cutting down billboards and driving bulldozers off cliffs? What is civil disobedience? Where's the line? What's appropriate? What starts to become culturally fringy? And Ed Abbey is going to, he's totally into the fringe, more extreme notions, not by any means anything harming individuals or people, quite the opposite. But he's also not against some property damage. And then also we have in here, along with the Aldo Leopold, kind of John Muir conservation. So that's these are going to be the forces, all the forces that we've been studying over the since the beginning of the semester are leading us to the current, as we kind of do this chronological sequencing, move us to the current notion of modern environmentalism. And you do need to understand, which I'm sure you probably do, but environmentalism, as any political movement, is really a continuum. There's going to be people who are way over here on one level of the extreme, and there's going to be people way over here on another level, and then there's going to be moderation in the middle, and the whole spectrum can all be kind of under the umbrella of the term environmentalism. So moving on, Ed Abbey, talking about Ed Abbey a little bit. One of the most prolific modern environmental writers. He was a larger than life personality. His writing, love or hate his politics, his writing is lyrical. It's beautiful to read. I love hearing Ed Abbey read it out loud. Very powerful voice within the environmental movement because of his mastery of social critique, his mastery of the English language. In the Monkey Wrench Gang, how is from those documentary videos you watch, he did a really good job of making environmentalism fun and exciting, and like I said, on the fringe, which from an entertainment standpoint, people very much like. His characterization in there, he created 4 main characters, all really unique, all wild. I highly encourage the read. Again, even these 2 are kind of his most well-known books: Desert Solitaire, which is nonfiction, and then fiction here, Monkey Wrench Gang. If you're going to read any of these at some point, I would encourage you to at least start with these 2. Great fiction book about, ecological monkey wrenching. And then this is a very reflective, more philosophical piece about him living in Arches National Monument as a ranger, and really kind of solidifying his view on what constitutes appropriate human interaction within the wild and within preserved lands or within a national park or national monument. And he's no hold bar as far as he is very aggressively critiques contemporary, in this case in the 1960s and 70s, American culture and American values. So this is where we kind of get the notion of him being a classical anarchist from both of these texts. Really will fuel into this. And in terms of classical anarchy, classical anarchy has kind of gotten the rap, the more present day, as no rules whatsoever. And I would say that from a philosophical standpoint, classical anarchy, as it's now referred to, is a little bit more contained than maybe a modern interpretation of what anarchy means. And in this particular case, a classical anarchist has I think what Abbey referred to, or one of the other people talking about Abbey's classical anarchist tendencies, is a severe distrust of any centralized power. Any centralized power whatsoever, whether that be government, whether that be economic. His form of anarchism has a severe distrust of that. So moving on, I would like to obviously encourage you to check out Abbey at some point in your future. But let's start talking about some of his direct quotes. He was a very prolific writer. He wrote about 25 books in total, a mixture of fiction and nonfiction. He was loved and hated. Far more controversy around Abbey than some of these other writers that we've read. I mean, I guess Thoreau was fairly controversial, and if you could say that anybody had kind of carries on kind of a Thoreauvian critique of civilization, industrialization, and its kind of negative consequences or interactions sometimes with the natural world, Abby would be kind of the brainchild of, I think, that Thoreauvian tendency. So here we go. Up at the top, this is one of his famous quotes that gets regurgitated. Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of a cancer cell. And so, Abby was not of the opinion that civilization just needed to keep on advancing and improving and moving as fast as we could. And everything had to get bigger and better and bigger and better and bigger and better. He did not condone that general approach to viewing the world and the economy and our industrial nature. So, in his sense, which we can see his romantic and transcendental tendencies here. I mean, I think we can hear both romantic. Well, I'll read it and then we can analyze it. If America could be, once again, a nation of self-reliant farmers, craftsmen, hunters, ranchers, and artists, then the rich would have little power to dominate others, neither to serve nor rule. That was the American dream. And so I think Abby would very much count himself as, a red-blooded American, but he's going to be more of the libertarian bent of red-blooded American. And here we can see a patriot must always be ready to defend his country against his government. And so this is that kind of anarchist distrust. And then it rolls into this quote. Anarchism is not a romantic fable, but the hard-headed realization based on 5,000 years of experience that we cannot entrust the management of our lives to kings, priests, politicians, generals, and county commissioners. Edward Abbey. And so this kind of fuels his one of his other quotes. Society is like a stew. If you don't stir it up every once in a while, then the layer of scum floats to the top. And so Abby obviously had no concrete love of people at the top of the power chain. And then here, this is moving, and he's got a lot of quotes about wilderness. A lot of those were in the documentary we watched, so I didn't put as many of those in, but here are a couple that often get, you'll see on inspirational posters sometimes and other places. May your trails be crooked, winding, lonesome, dangerous, leading to the most amazing view. May your mountains rise into and above the clouds, where something strange and more beautiful, more full of wonder than your deepest dreams waits for you. So this right here, we studied the landscape painters, the Hudson River Valley, American romantic landscape painters. And this is obviously right there. We've got big, large views, crooked, dangerous, lonesome paths, those sort of sublime paths that move through the mountains. And then you rise above the clouds. And when you get above the clouds, you obviously get into the sun. And this is where we have the beautiful. So we have the beautiful, we have the sublime, we have the mountain, we have the person moving through the mountain on the precipice of the cliffs that I talked about earlier in our class. And so all of this is just entirely romantic. You throw in this distrust. Now, one thing that I want to note is that for the transcendental philosophies and the romantic philosophies, the distrust of government is because government is a product of civilization, according to the romantic. And so government is inherently to be mistrusted because of its correlation with civilization and industrialization and elements of capital, endless capital growth. And so he would much rather see this here, which if we take a look at this, self-reliant farmers, craftsmen, hunters, ranchers, this is all very pastoral. Remember the pasture, the move away from the city into the country. And then this, obviously, and all of these pieces inform this wilderness ethic. And this gets back to looking at, Aldo Leopold, and even going back into the tradition of Mir, is that wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit. So those are a few quotes I thought I could stitch together for you. Try to sort of explain, once again, if we're trying to look back at this first slide of where does modern environmentalism come from, and we look at anarchism, rugged individualism, civil disobedience, conservation, ecology, all of this stuff, we really see that Abby's writing and personal life and personal convictions really embody this whole thing. Oh, this, I forgot to show you. This right here is a map, and some of you may recognize it if you're Glacier Park aficionados. But this is Bowman Lake right here, and this is the Numa Lookout. And Edward Abbey spent in the mid 70s, I think 1974, 1975. He lived up there for a season or 2 seasons at the Fire Lookout. And so there's stories of him driving the North Fork Road and Pole Bridge and hiking around this whole region. So Edward Abbey was someone who spent time not only in the Southwest, which is really, I think, where his heart lie was in the American Southwest, but he also spent time in Glacier National Park. And one of the characters who is Hayduke, the fictional character in here, Doug Peacock, who is very instrumental in knowledge and education about grizzly bears, and he wrote a few books. He's influenced by this character, but to this day, Doug Peacock lives in Montana and was a friend of Abbey. So Abbey would come up and visit him in Montana, and at one point he lived up here. There's a story in the one documentary, the optional documentary, about Edward Abbey borrowing Doug Peacock's VW Bug and driving it up the North Fork Road and just destroying the car by driving too fast and recklessly. So some little local connection there. So the final thing that I want to go over is just kind of connecting this all together, all the personalities. This is Terry Tempest Williams, who we haven't gotten to yet, and this is Rachel Carson. We're going to be covering these two women in the next couple of units, both very significant contributors, literary contributors to what we would constitute as the modern environmental movement. Rachel Carson is going to talk about the influence of pesticides and the negative aspect of pesticides. She was a scientist and a science writer. She's going to write a book that we'll investigate called Silent Spring. Some of you may have heard of this, or you bumped into this in other courses. And Terry Tempest Williams is a Mormon woman, or came from a Mormon family in Utah, and talks about the Southwest. And so she actually had some experiences that in fact, it's even in the movie, her father and her family benefited greatly from, kind of extractive industries in Utah. But she took her father, who was a businessman, to see Abbey talk one time. And maybe you picked up on that quote. But let's kind of follow this path. So early on with John Muir here, we have, this idea of preservation moving into conservation, wanting to set aside Yosemite Park and set aside the formation of the national parks. He obviously was friends, as you all know, with Theodore Roosevelt, who was also kind of one of the founding influencers of the American conservation movement. And also as Muir was basically the founder of the Sierra Club, which is a modern environmental organization, far more moderate than Abbey. The Sierra Club is not very radical at all. They're, quite, on the environmental scale, quite conservative. And then, so conservation, we have Aldo Leopold up here. And then these folks are going to kind of move the conversation as we start to have ethical components here into this more environmental movement. And then that through Abbey, and not just through Abbey, there are other people at the time, but Abbey ends up kind of becoming the poster child for a more radical environmentalism. And this is where, things get really controversial. I mean, a lot of this is not nearly as controversial. At the time it was, but in present day, looking back, not nearly as controversial. But then we have Earth First, and Earth First is going to take, monkey wrenching and more direct protest activity in the 1970s. So this is going to be 70s and 80s, kind of to the next level, using the Monkey Wrench Gang as, kind of a cultural influence there. And then that's going to move into the 1990s, the other documentary about When a Tree Falls in the Forest. And this is going to take a look at the Earth Liberation Front, which at that time was also referred to as the acronym ELF. And so they're going to also, as we know, Earth First, not quite so much, but we're going to start seeing the term eco-terrorist start to pop out of the byproduct of, this more radical nature of the environmental political movement. So that's I hope that, getting back to the core focus of the class, we're looking at environmental imagination. How do people imagine the environment, the wilderness, the wilds, and then what do they do after they've started to have ethical, political, ecological, all of these component views? And then how do we crouch that within a history of American pastoralism, romanticism, and transcendentalism? And that's where we are. So in the next couple of units, as you know, we're going to take a look next at Rachel Carson, and then we're going to take a look at the writing of Terry Tempest Williams, and then we're going to be moving on toward the final exam. So let me know if you have any questions. And always, thanks.